She returned as a lawyer, and her first case was suing her billionaire ex for custody of their twins. The first time my ex tried to claim my children, he didn't even have the courage to say their names. He had his lawyers send a petition demanding shared custody of the twins he once told me to get rid of because they were bad for his IPO. What he didn't know was that the woman he abandoned pregnant 5 years earlier had just passed the bar and was now the attorney suing him for custody. If you've ever watched a man choose his reputation over his own family, you already know this isn't just a legal case, it's a reckoning. Stay with me. Because by the time we walk out of that courtroom, a billionaire will be forced to answer for every quiet night a mother spent raising the children he never chose. The courthouse smelled like old paper and furniture polish. I noticed that first before the marble floors, before the vaulted ceilings, before the weight of what I was about to do settled into my chest like a stone. I'd been a lawyer for exactly 11 days. 11 days of business cards that still smelled like ink, of fumbling with courtroom procedure, of waking up at 4 a.m. convinced I'd forget how to introduce evidence. And here I was, walking into my first real case with a leather briefcase. Teresa bought me as a graduation gift, and a confidence I didn't entirely feel but had learned to fake. The brief was tucked inside. Calvin Hopkins versus Marion Rogers. Custody dispute. Immediate petition for shared parenting time. I'd read it so many times the words had lost meaning, but his name never did. Calvin Hopkins. There was a time when that name made me feel safe, chosen, loved in a way I didn't have words for. Now it just made me tired. Because 5 years ago, Calvin Hopkins told me our baby would complicate things. And when the ultrasound showed twins 2 heartbeats where he hadn't even wanted one, he went silent in a way that told me everything. I left 2 weeks later. No goodbye scene. No shouting match in his penthouse. No leaked story to the press about the billionaire who got his analyst pregnant and walked away. Just a resignation email, a one-way ticket, and a promise I made to myself in a studio apartment bathroom at 3 a.m. While John screamed with colic and Jessica refused to sleep unless I was holding her. They will never feel unwanted. And for 5 years, I kept that promise. I worked shifts that broke me. I studied case law with a baby strapped to my chest. I learned to write legal arguments on 2 hours of sleep and cold coffee, to memorize statutes while singing lullabies, to be both mother and provider and protector all at once. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because they deserved better than a mother who gave up. But now, standing in this courthouse, holding a brief with Calvin's name, printed across the top, like it still had power over me, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't here to prove I survived without him. I was here because he thought money could erase 5 years of silence. The courtroom doors were still closed. I could hear voices inside, muffled, official, the hum of a case wrapping up. I stood off to the side, back straight, breathing steady. Across the hallway, I saw them. Calvin's legal team, 3 men in suits that probably cost more than my first year of law school. Leather portfolios, expensive watches, the kind of confidence that comes from never losing. And then him, Calvin Hopkins. He looked the same. Older, maybe, sharper around the edges, but the same man who used to pull me into empty conference rooms and kiss me like the rest of the world didn't exist. The same man who once promised me we'd figure it out and then stopped returning my calls. He was standing near the window, hands in his pockets, listening to something his lead attorney, Matthew, I'd learned from the brief, was saying. He hadn't seen me yet. That was intentional. I positioned myself just out of his line of sight, close enough to observe, far enough to stay invisible. Because the moment he realized I was here not as the woman he left, but as the lawyer across the table, everything would change. The courtroom doors opened. A bailiff stepped out. Hopkins v. Rogers. Counsel, please enter. Matthew turned first, adjusting his tie. Then Calvin. He took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped. His eyes swept the hallway routine, distracted, and landed on me. For a moment, nothing. Just recognition trying to organize itself into sense. Then his face changed. Not shock, not fear. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like regret. Marion, he said. His voice was softer than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just forgotten what it sounded like when he wasn't giving orders. I met his eyes and kept my expression neutral, professional. "Mr. Hopkins," I said evenly, "please direct all communication through counsel." Matthew's head snapped toward me, then toward Calvin, then back to me, realization dawning. Matthew started. "Attorney Marion Rogers," I finished, representing myself in this matter. "Shall we?" I walked past them into the courtroom without waiting for a response. Behind me, I heard Matthew's urgent whisper. "You didn't tell me she was a lawyer." Calvin didn't answer. Good, because the woman he left 5 years ago, the one who cried in parking lots and second-guessed every decision, she was gone. I'd spent 5 years becoming someone he couldn't dismiss. Someone who knew how to argue. Someone who knew how to win. And as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, setting my briefcase down with deliberate calm, I felt it. The shift in power. Because this wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about who had more resources, or better connections, or a company worth billions. This was about 2 children who didn't ask to be born into this mess. 2 children who deserved a father who chose them, not one who showed up 5 years late because an investor background check made him nervous. The judge hadn't entered yet. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my notes, organizing them with steady hands. Across the aisle, Calvin sat down slowly. He was still looking at me. I didn't look back, because the next time we spoke, it wouldn't be as exes trying to make sense of the past. It would be as opposing counsel, and I'd spent 5 years preparing for this moment. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. "All rise." I stood. So did Calvin. And for the first time in 5 years, we were in the same room. But this time, I wasn't the one who'd have to leave. You know, there's something powerful about the moment you realize you're no longer afraid of the person who once made you feel small. Not because they've changed, but because you have. If you've ever walked back into a room where someone underestimated you and showed them exactly who you became without them, you understand what Marion was feeling. And if that's your story too, if you've ever had to become dangerous in silence just to survive, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel, because we tell the stories of women who refused to stay quiet. Stories of mothers who became warriors. Stories that remind you, you were never the problem. Hit that subscribe button. You'll want to hear what happens next. He didn't look at me again until the judge spoke his name. "Mr. Hopkins," the judge said, voice steady. "You're requesting immediate shared custody of the minors, John and Jessica Rogers. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Calvin answered. Hearing his voice in that room pulled something loose inside my chest, like a thread that had been waiting years for someone to tug it. I kept my eyes on the file in front of me. I had learned, a long time ago, that looking at him made it harder to think. Not always. Once, it made it impossible to think about anything else. When we were a secret. I was 23 the first time I saw him in person. Not on a magazine cover. Not in a headline about another acquisition. Not in a blurry photo attached to a think piece about the ruthless genius of Calvin Hopkins. In person. He walked into the conference room 5 minutes late to an all-hands meeting at Hopkins Analytics, and the room adjusted to him like it had been tilted and suddenly corrected. People straightened in their chairs. Laptops snapped shut. Even the air felt different, charged with something that was part fear, part admiration. I was the newest junior analyst on the floor, still figuring out where the good coffee was and how to not look terrified when presenting numbers to people who made more money in a bonus check than I'd seen in my entire life. I remember seeing him and thinking, he looks exactly like himself. There was no disconnect between the headlines and the man's sharp jaw, expensive suit, posture that said he was used to rooms making space for him. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. The head of our division did that for him, voice almost reverent. "Mr. Hopkins, thank you for joining us." Calvin gave a tight smile, nodded once, and took the seat at the head of the table. He didn't open a laptop. He didn't take notes. He just listened. And when someone's projections were off, he caught it before they finished their sentence. "Run that again," he said calmly. "Your Q3 numbers don't match the acquisition timeline." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was a quiet efficiency to his criticism that made everyone lean in a little closer, not because they liked him, but because they wanted to be good enough not to disappoint him. By the time the meeting ended, my palms were sweating. I hadn't spoken once, but I felt like I'd been measured and catalogued all the same. I stayed behind to pack up my papers, moving slowly, waiting for my heartbeat to return to something normal. "You're Rogers, right?" His voice came from behind me. I turned too quickly, nearly knocking over my water bottle. He was closer than I'd realized. Up close, he looked less like a headline and more like a person tired at the edges. Faint creases near his eyes that didn't quite qualify as wrinkles yet. "Yes, sir," I managed. "Marion Rogers, junior analyst. I read your restructuring memo," he said. I froze. My restructuring memo had been a desperate attempt to keep my job after noticing an inefficiency in one of our smaller accounts. I'd sent it up the chain, fully expecting it to die on someone's desk. "You read it?" I asked, trying not to sound like a child. He nodded. "You were right about the redundancy in the reporting flow," he said. "Cost us at least $2 million last year. Good work." Compliments from men like him weren't just words. They were currency. "Thank you," I said, cheeks burning. "You were the only one who saw it," he interrupted. "I like people who see what others miss." He held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he picked up his phone, his attention already shifting. "Send me anything else you find," he added, almost as an afterthought. Directly. He walked out before I could respond. That was how it started. Not with romance. With access. Private spaces. Unsaid promises. The first time he asked me to stay late, it was for work. At least, that's what I told myself. "Everyone else will just slow this down," he said, standing in the doorway of my cubicle while the floor emptied for the night. "You see patterns. I need that." It wasn't flattery. It was assessment. We worked until past midnight, the rest of the office dark, the city glowing through the wall of windows like a second sky. He ordered takeout without asking my preferences, and somehow the food that arrived was exactly what I would have chosen. "You don't talk much," he said, around 11 p.m., scanning a report. "You pay people to talk for you," I replied before I could stop myself. I figured silence was a promotion. He looked up at me then, surprised, and laughed. It was the first time I heard him sound human. Not like a CEO performing, not like a strategist manipulating a room, just a man who found something genuinely funny. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I am," I answered honestly. "I just hide it well." There was a pause where I could feel the floor tilt, just a little. "Don't be afraid," he said quietly. "Just don't waste my time." We started working late once a week, then twice, then enough that the security guard began nodding at me like I was part of the furniture. There were no declarations, no dramatic seduction, just a gradual narrowing of the distance between us. An extra chair pulled closer, a shared joke, a hand on the small of my back as we walked out of the building together, his palm warm through the thin fabric of my blouse. The first time he kissed me, it was in an elevator. We were leaving after yet another 12-hour day. I was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, my brain buzzing with numbers and charts. He pressed the button for the parking garage and leaned back against the mirrored wall, watching the doors close. "You're good at this," he said. "At leaving the office?" I teased. "At all of it," he said. "The analysis. The strategy. The way you don't flinch when people talk over you." I shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I flinch on the inside. He pushed off the wall and took a step closer. "Don't," he said. "You're smarter than half the people who work for me. You know that, right?" I didn't. Not really. But the way he said it made me want to believe him. The elevator hummed, descending. We were alone. He reached up, brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, and for a moment, the world went quiet. When he kissed me, it wasn't tentative. It was certain. Like he'd decided something and the rest was just execution. I kissed him back because I'd already decided, too. We both knew what we were doing. We just pretended not to. "It's complicated," he said later, in his penthouse, when the city was a blur of lights beyond the glass and my clothes were on the floor beside his. "You're my employee. I'm your boss. There are optics." I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the imprint of his hand still on my waist. "Then we don't tell anyone," I said. He turned his head to look at me, eyes dark in the low light. "You okay with that?" he asked. "No promises, no future, no us. Just a question, with 1,000 implications." I swallowed. "Yeah," I lied. "I'm okay with that." Because at 23, being his secret felt a lot like being chosen. Vulnerability versus ambition. The thing about men like Calvin is that they don't just take your time. They rearrange your idea of what's possible. He started sending me articles at 2 in the morning. "Read this tomorrow. Reminds me of you." He'd forward emails from investors with comments like, "You could handle this better than half my team." He'd ask my opinion on decisions that affected millions of dollars, then actually listen. In private, he treated me like an equal. In public, I was still Rogers from analytics. He never introduced me as anything more. No one ever asked why I was at late-night meetings or early breakfast briefings. No one wanted to risk being the one who noticed too much. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, doubt would creep in. "We're not really anything," I said once, sitting at his kitchen island while he poured wine. He didn't look up. "We're whatever we choose to be," he said simply. "What do you choose?" I pressed. He walked around the counter, set the glass in front of me, and kissed my forehead. "I choose you here," he said. "Where? It's simple." It wasn't simple. It just didn't exist anywhere that required him to be accountable. In his penthouse, his ambition looked charming. At the office, it looked like control. He knew everyone's weaknesses without ever writing them down. He knew who would crumble under pressure, who needed validation, who could be bought. He never shouted. He never swore. He just applied pressure exactly where it hurt most until people did what he needed. And somehow, I convinced myself I was the exception. That with me, he was different. That the softness he showed in the dark, the way he listened when I talked about growing up in a house where bills were paid late and dreams were considered luxuries that meant something. Looking back, I realized something painful. I gave him access to every vulnerable part of me. He gave me access to the parts of him that made him stronger. The pregnancy reveal. I knew before the test. My body felt occupied. Like someone else had moved in and rearranged the furniture. I was late, then later, then sick. Teresa was the first to say it out loud. "You know you're pregnant, right?" she asked, watching me dry heave into her sink after a night I blamed on bad takeout. I stared at my reflection, pale, exhausted, eyes haunted. "I can't be," I whispered. But I was. The 2 pink lines were clear, solid, real. I sat on the edge of my bathtub, the tile cold under my bare feet, the test shaking in my hand. I'd grown up in a world where pregnancy was a blessing when it came with a ring and a mortgage, and a crisis when it didn't. There was no version of this where people would say, "Congratulations," without also saying, "What are you going to do?" I told him, in his office. It was a Friday. The market had closed high, and there was a buzz in the building, numbers up. Projections exceeded. Another article calling him the golden boy of tech. He was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, tie loose. He looked tired but satisfied, like a man who'd won another quiet war. "Hey," he said, glancing up. "I thought we were meeting tomorrow." "We are," I said. "This isn't about work." That got his attention. He set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. "Everything okay?" he asked. "No," I said. "Yes, I don't know." My heart hammered so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "Marion," he said slowly, reading my face the way he read financial reports. "What's going on?" I closed the door. That was the moment everything could have been different. If he'd stood up, if he'd walked around the desk, if he'd reached for my hand and said, "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." But he stayed seated, distance already widening. "I'm pregnant," I said. The words fell between us, small and enormous at the same time. He didn't react at first. No shock, no anger, just stillness. "How far along?" he asked finally. "About 6 weeks," I said. "I took the test yesterday." Wanted to be sure. Before I told you, he nodded once. A micro-movement. A calculation. Okay, he said. Just that. No smile. No curse. No relief. Silence stretched. I'm going to keep it, I added, because somehow that wasn't obvious. His eyes flickered. There are options, he said carefully. You don't have to decide anything right now. I already decided, I replied. I watched the understanding land. Not just that there was a pregnancy, but that it came with a woman who wasn't going to quietly erase herself to make his life easier. This can't happen right now, Marion, he said, finally pushing back from his desk and standing. He started pacing, hands on his hips, eyes distant. My company is going public in less than a year, he continued. We're under scrutiny. Every decision I make is watched. The board is nervous enough as it is. If this gets out, it's a baby, not a scandal, I said, voice shaking. It's both if the story is billionaire tech CEO knocks up employee, he shot back. You know how this works. You're not naive. No, I said quietly. Just pregnant. He stopped pacing, ran a hand through his hair. Timing matters, he said. Optics matter. We're at a critical point. I can't afford distractions. I swallowed hard. And what am I, Calvin? I asked. A distraction? He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because in that moment, I saw it. The hierarchy of his priorities laid out in brutal clarity. Company, investors, board, image, somewhere far down the list me. And beneath even that, somewhere he didn't have to look at if he didn't want to our child. I thought. I started, then stopped. What had I thought? That love, whatever version of it we had, would outweigh his ambition? That the man who never made promises would suddenly start? I looked at him, really looked, at the man who built empires by cutting anything that threatened efficiency, and the truth settled over me like cold water. There would never be a right time for him. Not for this. Not for us. Not for two heartbeats that demanded more than his leftover hours and hidden weekends. This can't happen right now, he repeated, softer. No apology, just a verdict. I felt something inside me harden. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. A decision. You're right, I said, standing. He looked relieved, misreading me completely. We'll figure this out, he started. We can. I interrupted. You can't have this happen right now. He frowned. Marion. I can, I said. I will. I picked up my bag, my hands suddenly steady. You don't have to worry about optics, I added, walking to the door. You won't have to explain anything to the board, or the press, or anyone. He stared at me, confused. What are you saying? He asked. I'm saying you won't have to make room for us in your life, I replied, hand on the doorknob. You already decided. I opened the door and stepped out. He didn't follow. He didn't call my name. He let me walk away. And in that moment, I understood something that would echo through every choice I made after. If I waited for Calvin Hopkins to decide it was the right time to be a father, my child would spend their whole life waiting. So I left before he could ask me to. Before he could offer hush money. Before he could turn my pregnancy into another problem to be managed. I left while the choice was still mine. He thought he was protecting his future. He had no idea he was walking away from his own children. And he wouldn't find out until 5 years later, when their last name showed up on a report he couldn't ignore. Have you ever been told you were too much by someone who was actually just not enough? That's what Marion realized in that office. She wasn't too needy. She wasn't asking for the impossible. She was just asking a man to choose her. And he couldn't. If you've ever walked away from someone who made you feel like you were the problem when really, they just couldn't love you the way you deserved, leave a comment below. Tell me your story. You're not alone. And if this is hitting too close to home, hit that like button so more women see this. Because someone out there needs to know that leaving quietly doesn't make you weak. It makes you strategic. We'll see you in the next chapter. Marion's about to do something he never expected. She didn't know it yet. But the day I walked out of that building was the day I stopped waiting for him to become the man I needed him to be. I just didn't make a scene about it. Women like me are trained for quiet exits. We are raised to fold our pain into something polite, to apologize for taking up space, even as our lives are being rearranged without our consent. So I did what I'd been taught. I left gently. On paper, at least. Inside, it felt like an amputation, leaving without a scene. I bought the plane ticket at 2:17 a.m. The apartment was dark, except for the weak light from my laptop screen. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a long time before I finally typed in my card number, my billing address, my full name. One way. No return date. The confirmation email appeared in my inbox a few seconds later, neat and impersonal. "You're booked, Marion." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I was 11 weeks pregnant. The morning sickness had tapered off into a permanent, queasy awareness of my own body. My jeans no longer buttoned comfortably. My bras felt too tight. My world, once so small and manageable, work, sleep, Calvin, repeat, had tilted on its axis. I opened a new document. Subject line, resignation, effective immediately. There was a version of me that wanted to dump everything into that email. The truth. The hurt. The way his silence had carved out parts of me I didn't know could be hollow. I wanted to write, "I'm carrying your child, and I've never felt more disposable." Instead, I wrote what women are taught to write if they want to leave without burning the little safety they have left. "Dear Mr. Hopkins, please accept this email as formal notice of my resignation from Hopkins Analytics, effective immediately. I am grateful for the opportunities I have had to contribute to the company's growth and have learned a great deal during my time here. Respectfully, Marion Rogers." I read it 3 times. It sounded like every other resignation email I'd ever seen, which was the point. I hovered over send, my finger trembling. Once I clicked, there would be no more pretending this was a rough patch we'd work through. No more telling myself he just needed time to process. No more building castles in the air out of half-spoken promises and late-night confessions. I thought of his office, the blinds always half open, the city spread out beneath him like a conquered map. "This can't happen right now, Marion. Not, I don't want this. Not, I'm scared. Just timing and optics and IPOs." I clicked send. My inbox refreshed with a soft mechanical sound. A tiny, clinical sound. It felt nothing like the finality it carried. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time in the dim light, one hand resting on my still flat stomach. "It's just us now," I whispered. There was no answer, of course. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic 12 floors below. But something inside me settled. Not peace. Not yet. Resolve. The quiet exit. I didn't go back to the office. Human Resources sent a brief acknowledgement of my resignation the next day. Cold, efficient, punctual. They didn't ask for an exit interview. No one called to demand an explanation. In Calvin's world, people came and went all the time. Some got promotions. Some got pushed out. Some simply disappeared into the background noise of turnover. I chose to become one of the quiet disappearances. Teresa showed up to help me pack. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, folding a blouse and laying it gently into a cardboard box. "No," I admitted. "But I'm more sure than I am about staying." She paused. "How far along are you now?" she asked. "Almost 12 weeks. Her eyes softened. "Do you want me there when you tell your mom?" she asked. I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "I'm not telling her yet," I said. "She'll see it as a catastrophe. I need to decide what story I'm going to tell before I let her rewrite it for me." She nodded, understanding more than I could put into words. Teresa had grown up with the same kind of women I had, strong, tired, practical to the point of cruelty when it came to their daughters' lives. "Text me when you land," she said instead. "And Marion? Yeah? You're not weak for leaving quietly," she said. "You're strategic." I didn't feel strategic. I felt like a woman running away before the floor gave out under her feet. But sometimes survival looks like retreat. I carried my suitcase down the hallway myself. I locked the door to my studio apartment for the last time, slid the key under it, and walked away. No goodbye party. No last drink with coworkers. No final look back at the building where I'd spent the last few years learning how to impress a man who couldn't even say the word father without turning it into a problem. By the time my plane took off, the city was a smear of lights and fog beneath the clouds. I pressed a hand lightly to my abdomen as the plane climbed higher. "Hang on," I whispered. "We're changing everything." Pregnant with two, afraid alone. I found out about the twins at my first real appointment. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and something faintly floral, like someone had tried to cover up the reality of sickness with air freshener. The ultrasound technician was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and deep lines around her mouth that looked like they'd been carved by both laughter and worry. "First pregnancy?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice catching on the word. "Alone?" she added gently. "Yes," I repeated. She didn't make a face, didn't offer pity, just nodded. "Okay, sweetheart," she said. "Let's see what we've got." The room dimmed, cold gel on my skin, the machine whirring softly, and then sound. A rapid, insistent thudding. My heart lurched. "Is that?" I whispered. "Heartbeat," she said. "Strong one." Relief washed through me so hard I almost sobbed. Then she frowned slightly, moved the wand, adjusted the angle. "Hold still for me," she murmured. Panic surged. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Is something wrong?" She didn't answer right away. Then she smiled. "Oh," she said softly. "There?" I repeated, confused. She turned the screen toward me and pointed. "Here's one," she said, tracing a small, pulsing shape. "And here's the other." For a moment, the words didn't make sense. "The other?" I asked. She glanced at me, her smile widening. "You're having twins, sweetheart," she said. Every thought in my head went silent. Twins. Two. My mind tried to stack the realities like spreadsheets, but they wouldn't organize. Diapers. Formula. Cribs. Rent. Sleep. Time. Love. Could I love two children enough to make up for the man who'd already chosen not to love them at all? Tears slid down the sides of my face into my hairline. Is that okay?" I asked, voice shaking. "Are they okay?" "They're beautiful," she said firmly. "Strong heartbeats. Good size. This is good news. Even if it feels like a lot right now." It felt like standing at the base of a mountain with no ropes, no map, and a storm moving in. But there they were, two flickering lights on a screen, demanding to be reckoned with. Not problems, not complications. People. "I'm sorry your partner isn't here," she added carefully. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "He doesn't do this," I said. She gave me a long look. "Then he doesn't deserve this," she replied quietly. I carried those words with me long after the gel was wiped away and the printout of the ultrasound was tucked safely into my bag. Two blurry shapes, two heartbeats, two reasons to leave without looking back. The birth and the breaking point. Nothing prepares you for twins. You can read every book, watch every video, listen to every well-meaning lecture, and still, nothing prepares you for the relentless, overlapping needs of two new humans who didn't get the memo about taking turns. John was born first, red-faced, furious, announcing his presence with a scream that seemed far too big for his tiny body. Jessica followed 9 minutes later, quieter, her eyes wide open, taking in everything like she was already suspicious of the world she'd arrived in. Labor was a blur of pain and fear, and nurses' voices and the metallic tang of blood and disinfectant. There was a moment, in the thick of it, where I thought, I can't do this. Then I heard John's first cry, and under the roar of my own heartbeat, I thought, I have to. The days after were a haze of tiny diapers, lopsided swaddles, and the constant, bone-deep ache of sleep deprivation. John had colic. He screamed for hours, his little face scrunched up, his body stiff and miserable. Jessica refused to sleep unless she was touching me. If I tried to lay her in the bassinet, her eyes would snap open immediately, like a tiny alarm system. I learned to move like a thief, breathing shallowly, easing my body away from hers millimeter by millimeter, praying not to wake her. Sometimes I failed. Often I failed. At 3 a.m., with one baby howling and the other clinging to my shirt, failure felt like a permanent condition. Teresa was the one who kept me from unraveling completely. She showed up with groceries I didn't ask for, meals I barely tasted, and arms strong enough to hold a screaming infant without flinching. "Go shower," she'd say, taking John from me. "And don't you dare rush. I've got him." "You don't have to," I'd start. "Shut up and go," she'd interrupt lightly. "You smell like formula." And despair. When I cried because of hormones or exhaustion or the simple, overwhelming truth that I was responsible for 2 entire lives, she didn't tell me I was strong. She didn't tell me it would all be okay. She just said, "You're allowed to be tired and still be a good mother." Both can be true. On the worst nights, when the world shrank to the sound of John's cries and the ache in my back from pacing the same strip of floor over and over, I would whisper into the dark, "You are wanted. You are not mistakes. I choose you." I said it for them. I said it for the girl I'd once been, the one who thought love had to be earned by being easy, by being convenient, by never asking for too much. I said it to drown out the echo of his voice in my head. This can't happen right now. Oh, but it was happening. Every sleepless night. Every bottle washed at 4 a.m. Every appointment I went to alone. Every time I wrote "Father," not listed on a form, and watched the nurse's mouth flatten before she pasted on a smile. Law school as survival. The idea of law school came on a day when everything felt particularly fragile. The twins were 8 months old. Money was tight, was a polite word. I called it terrifying. I was working a part-time administrative job at a local firm that specialized in property disputes and small business contracts. I filed, I scheduled, I answered phones while bouncing a baby on my hip in my mind. One afternoon, I stayed late to finish up some scanning. The office was quiet, the harsh overhead lights softened by the dimness of an almost empty building. On my way out, I passed the senior partner's office. The door was open. On a shelf, a row of framed diplomas caught the light. Law degree, bar admission certificate, awards. I stopped. Not because I thought I could be like him, because I thought, someone like him gets to decide what happens to women like me. Men like him and like Calvin wrote the contracts, interpreted the clauses, argued the cases. They had language for things I had only feelings about: power, abandonment, responsibility. I went home and opened my laptop after the twins finally went down. Search bar. Law schools near me. Application deadlines. Entrance exam dates. Tuition costs that made my stomach clench. I almost closed the browser. Then I thought of the ultrasound tech's words. "Then he doesn't deserve this." I thought of Calvin's office, of his pacing, of his voice, stripped of softness. "This can't happen right now, Marion." I thought of my children someday asking me why their father wasn't there, why I left, why I stayed poor, tired, scared, while he collected magazine covers and awards. And I knew I needed more than a sad story. I needed tools, language, leverage. I filled out the application with John asleep on my lap and Jessica sprawled beside me, her hand resting on my thigh like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. When I got to the essay section, "Explain why you want to study law," I stared at the blinking cursor, fingers frozen. I didn't write about justice in the abstract. I wrote about women signing documents they didn't understand, about mothers begging for fairness from systems designed to exhaust them, about children becoming bargaining chips when there was conflict and collateral damage when there wasn't. I didn't mention Calvin by name. I didn't have to. He was between every line. I submitted the application and closed the laptop with a shaky breath. I didn't tell Teresa. I didn't tell my mother. I barely admitted it to myself. This wasn't ambition. It was triage. If I couldn't change who their father was, I could at least become the kind of woman who knew how to stand her ground when the world tried to move her. Weeks passed, then months. The twins learned to sit up, then to crawl. John moved like a small storm, barreling into furniture and people with equal enthusiasm. Jessica was more cautious, studying every surface before deciding if it was worth her effort. Bills came. I paid what I could. I borrowed when I had to. I swallowed pride like medicine. Life became a series of small, relentless decisions. Then one afternoon, when the twins were almost a year old, an envelope arrived in the mail. Thick. Official. My hands went cold. I knew what it was before I opened it. I also knew what it could be. A rejection. A polite, devastating no. I stood in the tiny living room, John balanced on one hip, Jessica on the other, both of them heavy and warm against me. The envelope shook slightly in my hand. Okay, I whispered to them. Moment of truth. I tore it open with my thumb, the paper rough against my skin. My eyes scanned the first line, then the second, then the third. My knees went weak. We are pleased to inform you. The room blurred. I didn't have a free hand to wipe my eyes. I laughed instead, a wet, broken sound, and pressed my forehead against John's. Jessica grabbed the edge of the letter, crumpling it, babbling loudly like she was adding her own commentary. I kissed the tops of their heads, breathing in the soft, milky scent of their hair. We're in, I whispered. Do you hear me? We're in. They didn't understand, of course. To them, it was just another sound in a world full of new noises. But to me, it was everything. A doorway, a weapon, a promise. I held them closer, the letter crushed between us. We'll be okay, I whispered into the space between their small, perfect heads. I didn't know how yet. The path ahead was long, brutal, uncertain. But for the first time since I'd sent that resignation email, I didn't feel like I was just running away. I was walking towards something, and one day, years from then, I would stand in a courtroom across from the man who once told me that my children were bad timing. And I wouldn't just be the woman he left. I would be the lawyer he never saw coming. You know what nobody tells you about survival? It's not dramatic. It's not one big heroic moment where you rise from the ashes and the music swells. It's 1,000 small decisions, made in the dark, when no one is watching. It's choosing law school with 2 babies on your lap. It's whispering promises to sleeping children that you're not even sure you can keep. It's deciding that even if you can't change the past, you can build a different future. If you've ever had to become your own hero because no one else showed up, share this video. Someone in your life needs to see it. And if Marian's story is reminding you of your own strength, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started. The courtroom is coming. And trust me, you'll want to see what happens when she finally gets to speak her truth. Power is quiet when it's real. It doesn't need to announce itself or ask for permission. It just sits in your spine, in the way you hold your pen, in the way you say, objection, Your Honor, without your voice shaking. But getting there? That was anything but quiet. Long nights, small hands. Law school brochures never show you what the kitchen table looks like when you're outlining constitutional law with 2 high chairs pushed up beside you. Yellow highlighter marks across dense, incomprehensible pages. Cold coffee with a film on top. One baby chewing on the corner of your casebook while the other flings peas onto the floor like confetti. That was my classroom as much as any lecture hall. Days were a blur of lectures and note-taking. Nights were diapers, bottles, and reading assignments that seemed to multiply every time I blinked. I'd come home from campus bone-tired, my head heavy with Latin phrases and precedent, and immediately switch into a different kind of triage. Feed them, change them, rock them, read, repeat. There were moments, usually around 2 a.m., when the exhaustion pressed so hard on my chest it felt like grief. Grief for the life I used to have. Grief for the woman who thought staying late in a glass office building was busy. That girl didn't know busy. Busy was briefing a case with a crying baby strapped to your chest because if you put him down, he'd wake his sister. Busy was memorizing elements of negligence while standing in the bathroom bouncing a colicky infant against your shoulder. Busy was fighting to keep your eyes open in class. Not because the professor was boring, but because you hadn't slept more than 2 hours in a row in days. Most of my classmates knew each other's names by the second week. They formed study groups, met for drinks, complained about workload and networking and pressure. I commuted in, sat near the aisle so I could slip out if daycare called, and raced out the second class ended so I could pick up the twins before late fees kicked in. I didn't go to happy hours. I went to the grocery store. I didn't bond over case law. I bonded over the best brand of diaper cream in the pharmacy aisle with other exhausted women I'd never see again. On campus, I was Rogers. At home, I was Mama. There was no version of me that existed without responsibility. Underestimated on sight. The first time a professor underestimated me out loud, it almost felt like a relief. At least now the bias had a face and a voice. It was contracts. 50 students. Tiered seating. A man at the front of the room who'd been teaching so long the casebook might as well have been dedicated to him. "Miss Rogers," he said, scanning the roster. Of course, he picked me the day I'd spilled formula on my only clean blouse and was pretending my blazer didn't smell faintly like baby powder. "Yes, Professor," I answered. "Explain the holding in Hadley versus Baxendale," he said, leaning back like he already knew I'd fumble. I could feel eyes on me. They'd noticed me, the woman who was always a little rumpled, who sometimes came in with a faint smear of something on her shoulder that might have been spit up or might have been yogurt, who didn't linger after class to laugh at his dry jokes. I took a breath, outlined the facts, identified the issue, explained the reasoning, summarized the rule. My voice didn't shake, not because I wasn't nervous, but because I'd rehearsed the answer while stirring oatmeal that morning, the twins babbling in their high chairs while I recited aloud. When I finished, the room was quiet. The professor narrowed his eyes. "Did someone give you that answer?" he asked. I blinked. "No, Professor," I said. "I read the case. Twice. Your article on it, too." A few students glanced at each other. He paused, then gave a curt nod. "Very well," he said. "Next time, don't read my article. Think for yourself." I sat down slowly, my pulse drumming in my ears. Later, in the hallway, I heard two classmates talking. "She only knows it because she doesn't have a social life," one said. "Must be nice," the other replied. "I was out until 2 a.m. last night." I walked past them, head high. They had no idea what 2 a.m. meant in my house. They had never held a screaming baby in one arm and a casebook in the other, praying neither would drop. Let them underestimate me, I thought. Underestimation is camouflage. And camouflage is a kind of power. Learning a different kind of fight. In my old life, conflict meant raised voices, hurt feelings, and long, sleepless nights replaying every word. With Calvin, I learned to avoid it, to soften my opinions, to swallow my hurt, to make myself smaller so his world stayed smooth. Law school taught me the opposite. "Stop apologizing," one of my professors said after class one day. I'd stayed behind to ask a question, hedging my way through a hypothetical, padding every assertion with, "I think," and "maybe," and "I'm not sure, but..." "Sorry," I said automatically. He arched an eyebrow. "Do you apologize before putting on your seatbelt?" he asked. "No," I said, confused. "Then why are you apologizing for using your brain?" he replied. "If you're wrong, you're wrong. But say it like you're allowed to be right." He walked away before I could answer. That night, after the twins finally fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote one sentence at the top of my notebook. Say it like you're allowed to be right. I started practicing. In class, when I raised my hand, I cut out the qualifiers. Not, "I think the court might have." Just, "The court held that." Not, "Maybe the defendant could argue." Just, "The defendant can argue." Something shifted internally with each small correction. It wasn't ego, it was clarity. Arguing cases on paper taught me to separate feeling from fact, injury from evidence. It didn't mean the hurt went away. It meant I learned to put it in the right container. When a case involved a woman losing her children because she couldn't afford a decent lawyer, I felt that in my bones. But when I wrote the brief, I didn't write about how angry I was. I wrote about due process, statutory interpretation, and the constitutional implications of economic disparity in access to counsel. Emotion made me human. Logic made me dangerous. Teresa's warning. Teresa watched the transformation happen in real time. She was there the night I argued with the TV during a legal drama, ripping apart the courtroom scene so thoroughly she had to pause the episode. "That's not how discovery works," I snapped. "And you can't just spring a surprise witness like that. That's grounds for..." "Okay, counselor," she laughed, hitting pause. Remind me never to end up across from you. I looked at her, mid-rant. What? I asked. She reached for her wine, still smiling. I'm serious, she said. You used to. Explain yourself. Now you argue. Clean. Precise. No wasted words. I thought of Calvin, of how small I'd made myself around him, of how careful I'd been not to push too hard, not to ask for more than he was willing to give. Back then, power terrified me. It felt like something other people had, and I survived by staying out of its way. Now, power felt like something you could learn, like a language. You studied the rules, learned where they bent, where they broke, and where they snapped back with teeth. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said quietly. Teresa's smile faded into something softer. You're not the one who should be worried about that, she replied. You're the one who should finally stop letting people hurt you. Her words lodged in my chest like a seed. Power no longer terrified me. What terrified me was what would happen if I didn't learn to use it for myself and for the two small people sleeping in the next room. Strategy, restraint, and the mirror. Moot court was where things clicked. Standing at a podium, facing a panel of sharp-eyed professors and third-year students pretending to argue a case in front of an appellate court. The first time, my palms were sweating so badly the page stuck to my fingers. I had 20 minutes to make my case. Whenever you're ready, Miss Rogers, the presiding judge said. I took a breath, remembered the professor's voice in my head. Say it like you're allowed to be right, and began. May it please the court. As I spoke, something strange happened. The fear didn't vanish, but it moved. It sank below the surface, like an undercurrent. Above it was something steadier. The outline I'd worked on until past midnight. The cases I'd read 3 times. The arguments I'd rearranged in the shower, in line at the store, while spooning mashed bananas into John's open mouth. When one of the judges interrupted with a question designed to knock me off balance, I paused, answered, and returned to my argument. It felt like dancing on a tightrope, but I didn't fall. Afterward, in the mirror of the ladies' room, I barely recognized myself. There were dark circles under my eyes. My hair was pinned up in a hurried twist. My blouse had a faint stain near the hem. I hoped no one had noticed. But my posture was different, straighter. The way I'd seen men like Calvin stand their whole lives. Not arrogant, certain. This is what dangerous looks like, Teresa said later. When I told her about it, over the phone. Exhausted and in discount heels? I joked. She chuckled. No, she said. A woman who knows exactly what she's capable of and doesn't need anyone else to validate it. I looked at the twins, playing with blocks on the living room floor. One day, I thought, they'll see this version of me. Not the woman who begged for scraps of attention from a man who couldn't say the word ours without thinking of his balance sheet. The woman who learned to speak in a language men like him couldn't ignore. Law. Passing the bar. By the time the bar exam came, I was beyond tired. Studying for it felt like trying to drink from a fire hose. Every subject was a flood. Criminal law, Civ Pro, property, torts, evidence. I studied while waiting in line, while laundry spun in the machine, while the twins napped, while they watched cartoons, their soft bodies leaning against my legs like anchors. On exam day, I kissed each of them on the forehead while they slept. Whispered, "This is for us," and walked out into the early gray light with my stomach in knots. The exam itself was a blur of questions and essays and time slipping through my fingers faster than I wanted. When it was over, the relief was almost worse than the anxiety, because now there was nothing to do but wait. Months later, results came out on a Thursday. I found out the way most people did, refreshing a page until it loaded, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I scanned the list once, eyes moving too fast to actually read. Then again, slower. There, my name, Rogers, Marion. I sat back in my chair, air leaving my lungs in a rush. The twins were older now, 4.5, all elbows and questions and energy that didn't know where to go in a small apartment. They were in the living room, arguing over a toy. "John, share," I called, voice unsteady. He huffed, but handed it over. I walked out to them, the room suddenly sharper, clearer. "Hey," I said, dropping to my knees between them. "Come here." They climbed onto my lap without hesitation, arms wrapping around my neck. I kissed their cheeks, their foreheads, their hair. "What's wrong, Mama?" Jessica asked, studying my face. "Nothing," I said, tears slipping free anyway. "Something is very, very right." I didn't tell them I'd passed the bar. They wouldn't understand what that meant, but I did. It meant the years of exhaustion had turned into a license, not for status, for protection, for leverage, for a voice that could be heard in rooms where decisions were made about people who never got invited inside. We celebrated with cheap ice cream and cartoons. I let them stay up later than usual. They fell asleep on the couch, sticky-faced and content. I carried them to bed one at a time, muscles screaming but heart light. For one small, fragile moment, there was peace. Then, the next morning, another envelope arrived. Thick, expensive paper. The return address printed in a font that thought a lot of itself. A law firm name I didn't recognize, embossed in dark blue. I felt it before I opened it. The past, tapping on my front door, polite and poisonous. My thumb slid under the flap. Inside, a neatly folded letter. My eyes moved to the header first. Attorneys for Mr. Calvin Hopkins. The room tilted. 5 years of silence collapsed into one sentence. He had finally noticed. Not me. Not really. But something that had his name written into it, whether he'd wanted it there or not. Our children. My law license sat on the table behind me, still unsmoothed from where I'd pressed it down with my hands. In 1 week, I had become exactly what I needed to be. A lawyer, a mother, and now, opposition. The woman Calvin Hopkins once told, "This can't happen right now," had just passed the bar, and the first letter bearing his name arrived exactly in time to find her ready. There's a moment in every woman's life when she realizes she's no longer the girl who needed permission to take up space. Marion spent 5 years becoming someone Calvin couldn't ignore. Not louder, not angrier, just sharper, more precise, unmovable. If you've ever had to teach yourself something difficult, law, business, survival, just to prove you weren't what someone said you were, drop a comment. Tell me what you learned, because your story matters. And if you're watching this and thinking, "I wish I had her courage," let me tell you something. You do. You just haven't needed to use it yet. Hit that like button if Marion's journey is inspiring you. And subscribe, because the courtroom confrontation is coming, and you will not want to miss it. It didn't start with a phone call. There was no, "Marion, we need to talk." No late-night message asking if he could finally hear their voices. No clumsy attempt at an apology that arrived 5 years too late. It started with paper. Like everything else in his world. How he found them. Later, much later, when discovery cracked his life open in neat, numbered exhibits, I would see the trail. The investor background checks. The quiet questions. The flagged report. But in my apartment that morning, all I had was an envelope. Thicker than a bill. Smarter than junk mail. Dense with the kind of weight that meant someone had paid a lot of money to make sure it terrified me before I even opened it. I recognized the law firm's name before I recognized anything else. National. Powerful. The kind of firm that made judges sit up a little straighter, and opposing counsel swallow hard. My hands didn't shake as I opened it. That surprised me. Inside, the letterhead screamed status. Underneath it, the words were clean, organized, suffocating. On behalf of our client, Mr. Calvin Hopkins. I skimmed. Legalese wrapped around something very simple. He'd found out. Not because his conscience had finally kept him up at night. Not because some memory of my laughter, or my tears, or my shaking hands in his office had come back to haunt him. Because his investors wanted reassurance. Because someone, somewhere, had typed his name into a system and stumbled across mine. And then across 2 small people who shared half his DNA and none of his last name. Twins. John and Jessica Rogers. Background noise, until they weren't. They were a liability issue before they were a moral one. And liabilities are problems men like Calvin know how to handle. The letter did not say, "I'm sorry." It did not say, "How are they?" It said, "Petition for shared custody." like it was the most natural sequence in the world. Abandon. Ignore. Return with paperwork. Not an apology. A petition. The petition was attached. I spread the pages out on my kitchen table, moving aside coloring books and a half-finished bowl of cereal whose milk had gone lukewarm. Each paragraph was a weapon dressed as concern. They listed his home address, his income, his assets, his capacity to provide a stable and enriched environment. He had private schools ready, trust funds drafted, vacation homes with extra bedrooms that could be painted in primary colors. He was prepared to be a father now, as long as it fit inside the life he'd already built. The petition never once used the word abandonment. It used words like opportunity and involvement and shared responsibility. It argued that his absence had been based on incomplete information and lack of awareness of his paternity status. I actually laughed when I read that. A short, sharp sound that didn't feel like humor at all. Incomplete information. That was one way to describe a choice he'd made with his eyes wide open. The twins were in the living room, their voices rising and falling over the sound of a cartoon. I could see them through the doorway. Jessica curled on the couch with a blanket, thumb in her mouth, John on the floor with his toy trucks, making engine noises like the world depended on it. They did not know that their lives had just been picked up by lawyers, who saw them as minors and dependents and future beneficiaries. To them, their world was still small and safe. Mama, Teresa, their daycare teacher, block towers and snack time and arguments over sharing. Their father was a blank space. I liked it that way. Blank spaces hurt less than scars. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. Unknown number. I answered on instinct. Hello? Is this Miss Marion Rogers? A woman's voice asked, smooth, professional. Yes. This is Evelyn Davis, she said. I'm head of public relations for Hopkins Global. Of course he had a head of PR. Of course she was the one calling, not him. Public relations, I repeated. So this is about image, then. That tracks. She hesitated for half a beat. I understand this is unexpected, she said. Mr. Hopkins only recently became aware of the children. He wants to do the right thing. There it was. The spin. The narrative. The phrase that would play well in magazine profiles and talk show interviews. The billionaire who didn't know he had kids. The devoted father making up for lost time. The right thing, I echoed. Interesting choice of words. Miss Rogers Marion, may I call you that? She asked. No, I said. You may not. Silence. Then a very careful inhale. Mr. Hopkins wants to be in their lives, she said. He's prepared to provide for them in ways that could be enormously beneficial. Education. Healthcare. Security. I'm sure you've seen the petition. I have it in front of me, I replied. Curious thing, though. I don't see the words, I'm sorry, anywhere. Legal language is different, she said. Apologies aren't always advisable on paper. Apologies aren't really his style anywhere, I said quietly. We established that a long time ago. She pressed on, as if I hadn't spoken. This doesn't have to be adversarial, she said. He wants shared custody. Time with them. It's an opportunity for them to know their father. He had an opportunity, I said, 5 years ago. That was a complicated time in his life, she said smoothly. His company was going public, being watched, needing clean optics. I finished for her, I remember. The silence on the line this time was heavier. How much is he paying you to make this sound noble? I asked. Marion. Miss Rogers, I corrected. She adjusted. Miss Rogers, she said. He's trying to do the right thing now. Too late. That's what I wanted to say. Instead, I looked at the petition again. At the way it framed me, as the primary caregiver, yes, but also as a barrier. The tone was subtle, but it was there. Their lives would be better if he were allowed in. My reluctance was an obstacle, not a perspective. He wanted access. He wanted weekends. He wanted holidays. He wanted photos on mantles and seats at company family days, and a story he could tell about how he'd reconnected with his kids. He wanted legacy, not love, control wrapped in concern. Tell Mr. Hopkins he's going to get exactly what he asked for, I said finally. And what is that? She asked. I let out a slow breath. A legal process, I replied. Goodbye, Miss Davis. I hung up. My hands were still steady. The woman who used to crumble at the sight of his name would have cried, begged, negotiated. This version of me just walked to the bookshelf, pulled down a blank legal pad, and began to write. This isn't love. I sat there for a long time. The petition on one side, my notes on the other. The facts were simple. He knew about the pregnancy. He made his priorities clear. He let me walk away. He did not attempt contact. He did not ask. He did not look. Now that investors and background checks and potential scandals were at stake, he suddenly wanted to be involved. If this had been about love, he would have picked up a phone. If this had been about regret, he would have shown up himself, not hidden behind a law firm and a head of PR. If this had been about the twins as human beings, the letter would have started with their names, not his. John and Jessica. Not the minors. Not the children. My children. I thought of all the nights I'd spent pacing with a feverish baby, whispering, "You are wanted," into the dark. All the mornings I'd left for class with guilt clawing at my throat because I was handing them off to someone else so I could sit in a room and learn how to argue with men like him. All the birthdays and broken crayons and scraped knees. There is a kind of rage that burns hot and fast, leaving you exhausted and empty. This wasn't that. This was cold, clean, sharp. This was looking at the situation the way he would. Identify the problem, assess the leverage, choose the strategy. My children were not leverage, but the law was. I picked up my pen. On the top of the legal pad, in neat block letters, I wrote, Rogers v. Hopkins, petition for sole custody. Not reaction, action. If he wanted to bring the law into this, he was going to meet it. Not as a scared girl who'd once worshipped him. As a woman who knew exactly how to use the system he thought belonged to him. Filing first. I went into work the next morning with the letter in my bag and a decision already made. The small firm where I worked had never handled anything close to the scale of billionaire tech magnate gets sued by former employee and mother of his children. They handled landlord disputes and minor contract breaches and the occasional messy divorce. My boss, Mr. Chen, was in his office when I knocked. Got a minute? I asked. He glanced up from his computer. For you? Sure, he said, nodding to the chair. I sat down and placed the letter on his desk. He read it. His eyebrows climbed with each line. By the time he was done, he let out a low whistle. Wow, he said. You know how to pick them. I picked him 5 years ago, I said. This picked me. He leaned back. So the rumors were true, he said gently. They're his. Yes. And he didn't know? He did, I said. He just didn't want to. Mr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. What do you want to do? He asked. Nobody had asked me that 5 years ago. Not really. It had always been about what Calvin wanted, what his board needed, what the market would tolerate. Now, the question sat in front of me like an open door. I straightened. I want to file, I said. First. His eyes sharpened. As what? He asked. Petitioner or respondent? As myself, I replied. As John and Jessica's mother. And as their attorney. He studied me. You're fresh out of the bar, he said. No courtroom experience beyond moot court. This will be brutal. Public. Expensive. He'll have a team with more resources than we've ever seen. I know, I said. He will try to destroy your credibility, he continued. Your choices. Your past. I know. He'll take every insecurity you have and use it as a weapon. I'm aware. And you still want to stand in front of a judge and say, my name is Attorney Marion Rogers and I represent the plaintiff? I swallowed, felt the weight of my answer settle into my bones. Yes, I said. Because if I let someone else speak for me, they'll soften the edges. Call this a misunderstanding. Frame it as a reconciliation. It's not. It's a matter of record. He watched me for another long moment. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. We'll file. We? I asked. He smiled faintly. You think I'm letting you go to war with a billionaire alone? He said. You'll be lead counsel. I'll be second chair. You'll need someone at your side who remembers to eat. A laugh escaped me, small and shocked. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet, he replied. This is going to get ugly, and it's going to get personal. It already is, I said. Naming herself. Filing the petition felt almost anticlimactic. No dramatic music. No gasp from a watching crowd. Just a clerk behind a plexiglass window, nails painted a cheerful red, stamping the documents with a heavy, satisfying thunk. Case number will be assigned by the end of the day, she said, sliding the receipt back to me. I nodded. Thank you. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, sharper. I stood on the steps for a moment, looking at the sky, at the people rushing past on the sidewalk, at the cars inching through traffic. Somewhere, in a glass office tower, Calvin Hopkins was living a life meticulously designed to minimize surprise. Earnings reports, investor calls, strategic planning sessions. He had no idea his name had just been paired with mine in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with accountability. Rogers v. Hopkins. Plaintiff, Marion L. Rogers. Defendant, Calvin J. Hopkins. Cause of action, custody. The question wasn't whether he had rights. The question was whether he had earned them. He hadn't. And the story we were about to tell would make that very clear. I went home, hugged the twins so tightly they squirmed and protested, then set about assembling everything I would need. Medical records, school enrollment forms, photos, messages, financial records showing exactly who had paid for what and when. 5 years of evidence that, in every way that mattered, I had been a parent and he had been a ghost. The court date, the notice came 2 weeks later. I'd been expecting it. That didn't make the moment any less electric. I opened the mail over the sink, a dish towel thrown over my shoulder, something simmering on the stove. Case scheduling order. Preliminary hearing date. Time. Department. Assigned judge. At the top, the full caption, Superior Court of State. Family Division. Marion L. Rogers. Plaintiff, W. Calvin J. Hopkins. Defendant. I read it twice. Then a third time. It hit differently, seeing it in black and white, official, and undeniable. This was no longer a bad memory I carried alone. It was a case. A story with a forum, rules, a referee. John, Jesse, I called. They scampered into the kitchen, sneakers squeaking on the tile. Yeah, Mama? John asked. What? Jessica echoed, breathless. I knelt, one hand on each of their small shoulders. Nothing you have to worry about, I said softly. Just grown-up stuff. They accepted that easily. Their worlds were still mercifully simple. Can we have snacks? Jessica asked. I smiled. Yeah, I said. You can have snacks. As they ran back to the living room, chattering, I turned back to the notice. For years, Calvin had written the script. He chose when to call, when not to. When to show up, when to disappear. He decided what was possible, what was acceptable, what was good timing. Not anymore. The court date was set. The caption was written. The roles were clear. Plaintiff, the woman who raised his children. Defendant, the man who decided they were bad for business until they looked good for his image. The first time I saw his name again, it had been on a legal brief. The next time, it would be when the clerk called the case. Rogers v. Hopkins. And he would stand when the judge entered, just like everyone else. You know what control looks like when a woman finally takes it back? It doesn't look like screaming. It doesn't look like revenge. It looks like Marion, standing in a courthouse, filing her own petition before he could define the narrative. Because the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to rewrite history is to speak first and speak truth. If you've ever had to be your own lawyer, your own advocate, your own voice in a room full of people who underestimated you, this story is for you. Comment below. What's one time you stood up for yourself when no one else would? I want to hear it. Your story could inspire someone else watching this right now. And subscribe to this channel, because we're about to walk into that courtroom. Marion is about to face Calvin for the first time in 5 years. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. The reunion is coming. And it's going to be powerful. He heard my name before he saw my face. Case number 24, FC 9187. The clerk called, voice echoing off the paneled walls. Rogers versus Hopkins. Parties and counsel, please approach. I stood. Across the aisle, he stood too. For a heartbeat, we were just two people rising to our feet because the system told us to. Then he turned, following his attorney toward the front. And he saw me. Collision in open court. The courtroom was colder than I remembered from my first visit. The air conditioning hummed too high, the wood of the counsel tables polished to a shine that showed every fingerprint. I walked to the plaintiff's table, file in hand, the heels of my shoes clicking softly against the floor. My robe wasn't the flowing kind you see on television. It was simple, black, a little too big at the shoulders, still stiff from being new. I wore it anyway. Attorney, not spectator. Across from me, Calvin's lead counsel, Matthew Lawrence, took his place at the defense table. He was exactly the sort of lawyer Calvin would hire. Tall, expensively forgettable, everything from his haircut to his tie calibrated to inspire confidence, but not individuality. Calvin stopped just behind him, his gaze fixed on me. For a second, it was like being back in that elevator, young and foolish, his attention knocking the air out of my lungs. Then the moment passed. I set my file down, uncapped my pen, and opened my legal pad. Marion, he said, voice low but audible. I didn't look up. Mr. Hopkins, I replied, eyes on the case caption. Please direct all communication through your counsel. The formality cut through the space between us like glass. Matthew looked between us, confusion flashing across his face before his training smoothed it out. You know each other, he said slowly. I lifted my eyes then, just long enough to meet his. Yes, I said. We have history. That's why we're here. Calvin flinched, almost imperceptibly. Your Honor is entering, the bailiff announced. All rise. We did. The judge, Honorable Ellen Navarro, took the bench. She was in her late 50s, with iron gray hair pulled back into a bun and an expression that suggested she had seen everything humanity had to offer and remained unimpressed. Be seated, she said. The shuffle of bodies settling rang louder in my ears than it should have. Counsel, state your appearances for the record, she instructed. I stood. Attorney Marion L. Rogers, appearing on behalf of the plaintiff, Your Honor. I said, voice steady. There it was. My name. My title, in the same sentence as his. Matthew rose. Matthew Lawrence, Your Honor. On behalf of the respondent, Mr. Hopkins, he said. The judge's gaze flicked between us. Noted, she said. Her eyes lingered on me a fraction longer. Miss Rogers, you are representing yourself in this matter? Yes, Your Honor, I replied, with co-counsel from my firm as needed. Ambitious, she murmured. Very well. She looked down at the file in front of her, flipping through pages. Given the nature of this case and the public profile of the respondent, this courtroom will remain closed to media unless otherwise ordered, she said. This is a custody matter, not a press event. I saw Calvin's jaw tighten, control slipping. Today is a preliminary hearing. Judge Navarro continued. We are not determining final custody, but rather setting parameters, temporary orders, and the scope of evidence. Do both sides understand? Yes, Your Honor, I said. Yes, Your Honor, Matthew echoed. She nodded. Miss Rogers, since you filed first, I'll hear from you first, she said. Briefly summarize the relief you are seeking. I rose again, the movement already becoming muscle memory. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't look at Calvin. I looked at the judge. At this stage, I'm seeking sole temporary legal and physical custody of my children, John and Jessica, I said. Continuation of their current living and schooling arrangements. Supervised, limited contact between them and Mr. Hopkins. Contingent on gradual introduction and psychological evaluation, if the court deems any contact appropriate at this time. The courtroom went very still. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My words did the work. On what basis? Judge Navarro asked. I met her gaze. On the basis of 5 years of complete abandonment, Your Honor, I said, which the evidence will show was intentional, informed, and motivated by image and convenience, not ignorance. Behind me, someone inhaled sharply. It might have been Calvin. It might have been me, the man who lost control. If guilt had a face, it was the way Calvin looked at me as I sat back down. His composure was there, but cracked around the edges, like glass left in the sun too long. Every time I'd seen him in the past, he had been the one with the plan. The one who set the agenda, decided the tone, controlled the room. Here, he was reacting. Matthew cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may, he said, standing. Go ahead, Mr. Lawrence, Judge Navarro replied. First, we strongly dispute the characterization of Mr. Hopkins' conduct as abandonment, he said. My client was unaware of the existence of the children until recently, and upon learning of them, took immediate steps to establish a legal and emotional relationship. He is seeking shared custody and reasonable parenting time, not to disrupt, but to enhance the minors' lives. Enhance, as if they were a portfolio. Your Honor, Matthew continued, Mr. Hopkins is prepared to provide substantial resources, stability, and opportunities. Private education, health care, a safe home environment. With respect, counsel, I said, rising, my children already have a safe home environment. Matthew shot me a look. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Lawrence, I will not be impressed by bank statements alone, she said. This is family court, not a venture capital pitch. Miss Rogers, you'll have your full opportunity to argue abandonment, but not by interrupting. Understood? Yes, Your Honor, I said. Yes, Your Honor, Matthew echoed. I sat again, gripping my pen to keep from gripping the edge of the table. Restraint, I reminded myself. Precision, not explosion. If I let him drag me back into the old dynamic, him calm, me emotional, I would have already lost. Mr. Hopkins, Judge Navarro said, turning her attention to him. Stand, please. He did. How old are your children? She asked. He hesitated. 4, he said. 5 and a few months. Do you know their birthdays? She asked. He blinked. Yes, he said. October 12th. Both? She asked. They're twins, he said, almost defensively. Yes, both. A muscle moved in her jaw. Do you know their middle names? She asked. He froze. For a flicker of a second, panic crossed his face. Then shame. No, Your Honor, he said quietly. The silence that followed was loud. I stared at my notes, forcing my expression to stay neutral. Inside, something small and wounded and vindicated twisted all at once. He was a man who could recite profit margins and market volatility and acquisition dates from memory, but not his own children's names. Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. You may sit, the judge said. He did, shoulders stiffer than when he'd stood. Matthew leaned in, whispering urgently. Calvin didn't look at him. He looked at me. And for the first time, I didn't look away. Professionalism as armor. Miss Rogers, Judge Navarro said. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. Yes, Your Honor, I replied. This is an emotionally charged case. I am aware of Mr. Hopkins' public profile, and I am aware of the inherent imbalance of resources between you, she said. However, my role is not to punish him for being wealthy or you for being poor. My role is to determine what is in the best interests of your children. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, I said. Which is precisely why I filed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing me. Do you intend to testify as both a party and an advocate? She asked. Yes, I said. I understand the risks. I also understand my own history better than anyone who could speak for me. I won't pretend otherwise. Matthew stood. Your Honor, we do have concerns about Miss Rogers' ability to remain objective while objectivity in family court is a myth, Mr. Lawrence, she cut in. We are all biased toward someone. The question is, whose bias aligns most closely with the children's welfare? Sit down. He did, chastened. I felt no triumph. Just a cold, steadying focus. Professionalism wasn't a mask to hide my feelings. It was armor. Every, Your Honor, every, respectfully, every carefully contained reaction was a way of saying, you don't get to define me anymore. I watched Calvin out of the corner of my eye as the judge spoke about temporary orders, scheduling, disclosure requirements. He shifted in his seat, hands clasped too tightly. I knew that posture. It was how he'd looked during high-stakes negotiations, outwardly composed, internally calculating. Except now, something else threaded through it. Guilt. It flashed in the way his eyes dropped when the judge mentioned consistent caretaking history. It shadowed his face when she said, 5 years with no contact is not easily explained. He glanced at me again, as if searching for some version of me who might still soften. She wasn't here. Guilt versus restraint. There were moments, sitting there, when memories clawed at the edges of my focus. The first time he'd told me I was the smartest person in the room. The way he'd kissed my forehead like it meant something. The night I'd sat on his couch, his hand on my belly. Before either of us knew there were 2 lives inside me instead of one. For a split second, that version of us hovered over the table like a ghost. Then the clerk handed the judge another file. Reality snapped back. Miss Rogers, you allege that Mr. Hopkins knew of your pregnancy and chose to distance himself to protect his public image, Judge Navarro said, tapping the page. Is that accurate? Yes, Your Honor, I said. And you, Mr. Hopkins, claim you believed Miss Rogers had chosen not to carry the pregnancy to term, she continued. Is that accurate? Yes, Your Honor, he said. She looked at him. Did you confirm that belief at any point? She asked. He hesitated. No, he said. So you assumed, she said. He swallowed. Yes. She turned to me. Do you have documentation of any communication between you during that time? She asked. Yes, Your Honor, I said. Emails, messages, and a formal severance letter referencing avoiding future obligations. I've disclosed copies to opposing counsel. Matthew stiffened. Judge Navarro's gaze sharpened. We'll address those during evidentiary hearings, she said. For now, I need to make one thing clear to both of you. She leaned forward slightly. This case is not going to be decided by who has more commas in their bank account, she said. It's going to be decided by actions and intent. Who showed up? Who didn't? Why? Her attention moved between us. Money can buy a lot. It cannot buy back time, she said. And it cannot buy off the record of the last 5 years. Calvin's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He looked like a man realizing that the usual tools in his arsenal, charm, influence, philanthropy, control, were blunt objects here. My restraint felt fragile, like glass balanced on edge. I wanted to stand. To list every night I'd spent alone. Every doctor's visit he'd missed. Every form I'd signed with one parent's information and a blank line where his should have been. Instead, I stayed seated. I knew my moment would come, and when it did, it would be under oath. Not as a wounded ex, as a witness. A new player enters. There's one more issue before we adjourn, Judge Navarro said, breaking the tension. Given the allegations and the high conflict potential of this case, the court finds it appropriate to appoint an independent child advocate. Matthew stood. Your Honor, my client is fully committed to. This is not a reflection of your client's commitment, she interrupted. This is standard practice when parents' narratives are in direct conflict and the stakes are this high. She turned toward the door to her chambers. Mr. Harris, you're up, she called. A man rose from one of the benches at the back. He'd been there the whole time, quiet, observing. Middle-aged, with kind eyes and a worn leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His suit was good, but not expensive. The sort of man people might overlook in a room full of sharper edges. He stepped forward. Robert Harris, Your Honor, he said. I accept appointment. Mr. Harris will serve as guardian ad litem for the minors, Judge Navarro announced. His job is not to please either of you. His job is to recommend what is in the best interests of your children, based on independent investigation. She looked at Calvin. He will speak to them, she said. To their teachers, to their doctors. He may visit both of your homes. She looked at me. He will ask hard questions, she added. Of both of you. I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Calvin shifted. Discomfort visible. He wasn't used to being examined. He was used to being the examiner. Mr. Harris glanced at me, then at him. Something flickered in his eyes, an understanding, maybe, of the story under the story. The court will provide my contact information to both parties, he said. We'll schedule interviews soon. Judge Navarro closed the file. Let me say this clearly so there is no misunderstanding, she said. This case is not about rewarding a mother for endurance or punishing a father for ambition. Her gaze hardened. It is about intent and abandonment, she said. About who chose these children when they were inconvenient, and who is choosing them now that they are visible. My throat tightened. She was speaking to both of us, but only one of us flinched. Next hearing is set for 6 weeks from today, she continued. Temporary orders will issue in writing. She stood. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. The sound cracked through me. Matthew turned to Calvin immediately, voice low and urgent. You should have called me the second you found out about those emails, he hissed. We need to control the narrative. Or, we can't control her, Calvin said, eyes on me. His voice held something I hadn't heard before. Fear. I gathered my files, sliding them back into my briefcase, every movement deliberate. I could feel his gaze like heat on my skin. Marion, he said again. Softer this time. I looked up. Not the way I used to. Not with hope or longing or the desperate need to be understood. Just level. Don't do this, he said quietly. We can work something out, privately. Privately is how we got here, I replied. The children deserve better than secrets and deals behind closed doors. His jaw worked. What do you want from me? He asked. That was the problem. For the first time since I'd known him, the answer was nothing. I'm not here to get something from you, Calvin, I said. I'm here to make sure you don't take something from them. Matthew touched his arm. We should go, he murmured. We'll regroup at the office. Calvin hesitated, then nodded. They walked out together, his shoulders squared, his stride measured. But for the first time, he wasn't leading. He was following. I turned to leave and nearly collided with Robert Harris. Miss Rogers, he said, stepping back. Sorry. It's all right, I said. He studied me for a moment. Intense first day, he said gently. That's one word for it, I answered. He nodded toward the emptying courtroom. Just so you know, he said. I don't care how many magazine covers he's been on, or how many sacrifices you've made. I care what I see when I meet your children. My spine straightened. That's fair, I said. They'll tell you who's been there. He nodded once, satisfied. I believe they will, he said. As I stepped out into the hallway, the echo of his words followed me. This wasn't going to be a contest of who could afford more tutors or nicer bedrooms. It was going to be an examination of intent, of abandonment, of who had chosen these children when they were invisible, and who wanted them now that they could be seen. For the first time since that envelope arrived, I felt a strange, fragile thing stir beneath the anger and fear. Not hope, something sharper. Advantage. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone realize they can't buy their way out of the consequences of their choices. Calvin Hopkins walked into that courtroom thinking his lawyers and his money would smooth everything over. Instead, he met a judge who asked him his own children's middle names, and he didn't know. That moment, that silence, says everything about what this case is really about. If you've ever watched someone finally get held accountable for something they thought they'd gotten away with, you know exactly what Marion felt in that room. Drop a like if you're rooting for Marion. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that justice doesn't always come fast. But it does come. Subscribe, because the next chapter is where the real fight begins. Evidence. Emails. Testimony. And one question that changes everything. Why now? You don't want to miss it. Some things look impressive on paper until you put them next to a child's actual life. Bank accounts, rankings, test scores, square footage. In family court, they shimmer for a moment, then go dull under the weight of one question. Who showed up? Exhibits and empty promises. By the time we reached the core of the custody hearings, the novelty of seeing Calvin in a courtroom had worn off. He looked like he always had in high-stakes settings: suit, immaculate, tie understated, expression composed. The only difference was that this time he wasn't selling a vision to investors. He was selling himself as a father. Matthew started the way I knew he would. With the court's permission, he said, we'd like to submit a packet outlining Mr. Hopkins' proposed educational and residential plan for the children. Judge Navarro adjusted her glasses. Proceed, she said. An assistant handed up thick binders, one for the judge, one for me. I opened mine. Color tabs, printed photos, charts. The first section was a glossy brochure for a private academy that looked like it had been pulled from a movie. A historic campus. Small class sizes. A list of alumni, whose names appeared on buildings and foundations. Mr. Hopkins has already secured preliminary admissions discussions with the administration, Matthew explained. They are willing to make exceptions given the children's unique circumstances. Unique circumstances. A polite way of saying, born in the wrong story, to the wrong woman, without the right name. The next section showcased his home, a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, a playroom already designed by an interior architect, a rooftop garden where, according to the notes, the children could experience nature in a safe, supervised environment. The photos were beautiful. So were the renderings of bedrooms in soft colors, lined with shelves ready for books and toys. Mr. Hopkins has also established trust funds in the children's names, Matthew continued, for their education, health care, and general welfare. He slid notarized documents across the table. Numbers with more zeros than I'd ever seen outside a textbook stared up at me. He was building a case in the language he spoke best: resources, access, opportunity. If the court is truly concerned with maximizing the children's futures, Matthew said smoothly, it's difficult to argue that they would not benefit from Mr. Hopkins' full involvement. He sat down with the confidence of a man who believed he'd just laid down a checkmate. Judge Navarro looked at me. Miss Rogers, she asked. Your response? I stood, my binder thinner, my pages less glossy. Your Honor, I began. No one is disputing that Mr. Hopkins is wealthy. He can provide elite schooling, travel, a certain kind of security, but custody isn't a competition for who can spend the most money. I opened my own file. The first exhibit was a stack of drawings on crumpled paper, edges frayed, colors bright and unsteady. Exhibit A, I said, these are my children's drawings from the past year. I held one up, a house with a crooked roof, 3 stick figures, all labeled in careful, uneven letters. Me, Mom, Mama, no Calvin, no Dad. The court has heard about Mr. Hopkins' proposed future, I said. These show you the children's present. I passed them up to the judge. She took them, eyes softening almost imperceptibly as she flipped through. Exhibit B, I continued, is a record of every pediatric appointment they've had since birth. A thick stack this time. Dates, vaccines, fevers, follow-up notes. My signature is on every line, I said quietly. I signed every consent form. I held their hands for every shot. I took every 2A.M. emergency visit when the fever wouldn't break. I didn't look at Calvin. Not yet. Exhibit C is their daycare and preschool records, I went on. Attendance, progress notes, incident reports. The last part hurt a little. The notes about John's extra energy, Jessica's shyness with new adults. Every time a form asked for a second parent contact, I said. That space stayed blank. The courtroom was silent. No glossy photos. No architectural renderings. Just paper that smelled faintly of real-life milk, crayons, printer ink, sweat. Mr. Hopkins' plan is impressive, I said. So is his home. So are his resources. But those things aren't proof that he's a father. They're proof that he's rich. I finally turned to look at him. He was watching me, jaw tight. The question before this court isn't whether he can buy them opportunities, I said. It's whether he chose them when it cost him something. The question that cut through. Robert Harris sat near the front, his portfolio open, notes neatly organized. By now, he'd met the twins. He'd sat on our worn couch while John tried to show him every toy he owned, and Jessica hovered at the edge of the room, half hidden behind my leg, until she decided he was safe. He'd gone to the penthouse, too. He'd seen the staged playroom, untouched, waiting. Now he rose, clearing his throat quietly. "Your Honor," he said. "May I ask the plaintiff a question?" Judge Navarro nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Harris," she said. He turned to me. "Miss Rogers," he said, "you've spoken about the past 5 years. About abandonment. About fear of disruption." "Yes," I replied. He glanced at his notes, then back at me. "In your petition and your testimony," he said, "you've been very clear about what you don't want Mr. Hopkins to do, what you don't want him to take, what you're afraid this will mean for the twins. But there's one question I need answered for myself, and for the court." He paused. "Why now?" he asked. The question hung there, heavy. "If you've done this alone for 5 years," he continued gently, "if you've protected them, created stability, built a life, why open the door to this fight now, instead of 4 years ago, or never?" It was a fair question, a dangerous one. I took a breath. Every answer that rose up first was about Calvin. Because he had money, because he had power, because he scared me. But this wasn't about him. It was about them. "When I left," I said slowly, "they were still ideas." I saw the judge lean forward slightly, listening. They were heartbeats on a screen, kicks I could feel but couldn't see. I continued. He was very clear about where we fit in his priorities. So I made a choice. I walked away before he could officially reject them. I wasn't going to stand between him and his IPO, begging him to love them. That would have made us props in his story. My voice stayed steady. My hands did not. I kept them flat on the table. For 5 years, my only job was to keep them safe and loved. Even when that meant letting the word father be a blank space instead of a wound, I said. I chose silence because anything else would have turned into a spectacle, and they were too small to understand it. I looked at Robert, at the judge, not at Calvin, but he changed that, I said. He brought lawyers. He filed petitions. He wants his name on their birth certificates, their school forms, their tax records. He wants legal authority, not just visits in a park. That's not something I can ignore. Once he decided to step into their lives on paper forcefully, through the courts, I had a choice. I swallowed. If I did nothing, he'd shape the story, I said. He'd arrive as the benevolent father who just found out and swooped in to offer a better life. My children would grow up thinking I kept them from him out of spite, or fear, or smallness. That's not the truth. I finally turned to Calvin. He was watching me like a man hearing his own autopsy. I'm here now, I said, because my children don't need a savior. They need stability. And I will not let them become an experiment in guilt. For a second, no one moved. Then Robert nodded, slowly. Thank you, he said. Judge Navarro's gaze softened, then sharpened again. There was no applause. This wasn't a movie, but something had shifted. The narrative wasn't rich man versus struggling woman anymore. It was about timing, choice, responsibility, what money couldn't cover. Later that afternoon, Calvin took the stand. Matthew guided him through a careful script. How did you feel when you learned you had children? He asked. Shocked, Calvin said. Overwhelmed, but grateful for a second chance. What have you done since learning about them? Matthew prompted. I set up trusts. I worked with professionals to learn how to support them emotionally, he said. I've adjusted my schedule, cut back on travel. I'm ready to be present. He was saying all the right things, wanted all the right things. Judge Navarro listened, impassive. Mr. Hopkins, she said, when Matthew finished, you've spoken at length about what you're prepared to do now. I have a question about what you did then. His fingers tightened on the edge of the witness stand. Yes, Your Honor, he said. Did you or did you not receive notice, 5 years ago, that Miss Rogers was pregnant? She asked. He hesitated. Yes, he said. I did. And at that time, did you encourage her to terminate the pregnancy? She asked. Matthew shifted. Objection, he began. Sustained as to phrasing, she said. She corrected herself. Let me rephrase. Did you express concerns about the pregnancy's impact on your career and public image? He couldn't dodge that. Yes, he said. Did you take any steps to follow up on her decision? She asked. No, he said. Did you hire anyone to check on her well-being? She asked. No. Did you attempt to contact her in the months following her resignation? She pressed. He looked down. No, he said. She leaned back. Thank you, she said. You may step down. He did. Slower than he'd stood. He walked past my table. Just for a moment, our eyes met. There was something raw there. Not the controlled intensity I remembered from boardrooms and late-night strategy sessions. Something closer to fear, regret. I looked away first this time, not because I couldn't bear it, but because I refused to carry it. In the hallway, the hearing ended for the day, with a flurry of scheduling and instructions. As we filtered out into the hallway, the air felt thick with everything that hadn't been said. I was halfway to the elevators when I heard his voice. Marion. I closed my eyes briefly, then turned. He stood a few feet away, Matthew hovering behind him like an anxious shadow. Mr. Hopkins, I said. He winced at the formality. Can we talk? He asked. Alone. Matthew stepped forward. I don't advise. I didn't ask for your advice. Calvin cut in, surprising us both. Give us a minute. Matthew hesitated, then retreated a few steps, pulling out his phone with the reluctant obedience of a man who knew which side his checks were signed on. We were alone enough that our voices wouldn't carry, but not so isolated that we could pretend this was anything but what it was. Two strangers who used to know each other. Do you hate me that much? He asked. He didn't sound accusatory. He sounded tired. There was a time when that question would have cracked me open, when I would have rushed to reassure him. I don't hate you, I would have said. I'm just hurt. I just want you to understand. That woman was gone. I studied him for a moment. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper. His hair had more silver at the temples. He looked like a man who'd won every game except the one that suddenly mattered most. Hate? I repeated, tasting the word. No. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. A clerk laughed. The building hummed with the indifferent life of other people's problems. I outgrew that, I said. The words landed between us with more force than if I'd shouted. He blinked. What does that even mean? He asked, thrown. It means there was a time when my world revolved around what you did or didn't feel for me, I said. When your silence was the loudest thing in my life. When I measured my worth by how much space I took up in your priorities. I shook my head. That time is over, I said. You don't get to be the center of my emotional universe anymore. You're just a man who made choices, a man my children will one day have to understand. That's it. He flinched, like I'd struck him. I'm trying, he said. Now, I said softly. You're doing everything you can now, not then. Not when it counted in the ways that leave marks you can't see on a balance sheet. His eyes shone, but he blinked it back. I can be good for them, he said. You know that. I know you can make their lives easier, I corrected. But that's not the same as making them feel safe. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. What do you want me to do? He asked. The way he said it told me everything. He was used to problems that could be fixed with effort, money, strategy. This wasn't one of them. I don't want you to do anything for me, I said. This stopped being about you and me the day they were born. Whatever comes next, it's going to be about what they need. And sometimes, what they need is protection. Even from you. He stepped back like the words had physical force. Matthew coughed gently from down the hall, reminding him the world still existed. We're not the enemies here, Calvin said, almost pleading. I thought of John's drawings, of Jessica's hand slipping into mine when she was scared. of every line I'd signed alone. A bitter smile touched my lips. "No," I said. "The enemy is the version of you that waited 5 years to act and still thinks this is about what you want." I turned before he could answer, walked toward the elevators, pressed the button. As the doors slid closed, I saw him through the narrowing gap. For once, he looked small in a hallway that had seemed built for men like him, the name behind the emails. That night, I spread out everything on my kitchen table. Court orders, my notes, Robert's preliminary report drafts, medical forms. I was looking for patterns, blind spots, anything we might have missed. That's when I noticed her name. It was small, tucked into the corner of one of the early severance documents like an afterthought. Prepared by Patricia Lane. I frowned. The name tugged at something in my memory. Then it clicked. Patricia, his executive assistant, the woman who used to hover outside his office, headset on, always knowing exactly where he needed to be and when. She'd left shortly before I did. No explanation. No public fallout. Just gone. I flipped to another document. Another reference. Internal memo. Subject. Severance package. Rogers, M. Her name again at the bottom. A slow heat crept up my neck. If anyone knew what he'd really said back then, it would be her. If anyone had seen the emails, the instructions, the spin before it hardened into official language, it would be the woman whose job it was to make those choices look tidy. I picked up my phone. "Chen?" I said when he answered. "We need to subpoena someone." "Who?" he asked. I looked at Patricia's name again, printed in neat black ink that did not yet know it would be pulled into the light. "His former assistant," I said. "I think she remembers more than his calendar." He was quiet for only a second. Then his voice sharpened. "Send me the details," he said. "We'll draft it in the morning." I hung up and stared at the table. For years, the truth had lived in private emails, in closed offices, in the memories of people paid not to talk. Now, one of those people was about to be asked questions under oath, not as an employee. As a witness, the next hearing would not just be about who could provide more. It would be about who had tried to quietly sever responsibility without leaving fingerprints. The subpoena would land on Patricia Lane's doorstep in a few days. When she opened it, she would see his name, and mine, and realize that the secret she'd helped bury was finally being dug up. The case was no longer just Rogers versus Hopkins. It was the truth versus the story he told himself so he could sleep at night. The worst secrets are the ones written down by people who never thought they'd be forced to read them aloud. They think time will bury them. Court has a way of digging. Patricia takes the stand. Patricia Lane looked smaller without the headset and the constant motion. On the stand, she was just a woman in a navy blazer, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes flicking nervously toward the man she used to organize her whole workday around. "State your name and former occupation for the record," Judge Navarro said. "Patricia Ann Lane," she replied. "I was Mr. Hopkins' executive assistant for 8 years. 8 years. Long enough to see patterns. Long enough to know which emergencies were real and which were theater." I rose from my chair. "Miss Lane," I began. "Do you recall when I resigned from Hopkins Analytics?" She swallowed. "Yes," she said. "You sent an email. It surprised some of us." "Why?" I asked. "You were considered valuable," she said. "Mr. Calvin relied on your reports. People noticed when he noticed someone." I let that sit for a moment. "After I resigned, were you involved in processing my severance?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "I coordinated with HR and legal." I held up a document. "Is this the severance memo you signed?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses, leaned forward, read, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "That's my signature." "And at the bottom," I said, "what does it say?" She hesitated. "Ensure Miss Rogers receives full severance and benefits without creating future obligations," she read. The words hung there, flat and ugly. "Who dictated that language?" I asked. Her fingers tightened in her lap. "Objection, calls for speculation," Matthew snapped, standing. "Overruled if she knows," Judge Navarro said. "Answer if you can, Miss Lane." Patricia took a breath. Mr. Hopkins did, she said quietly. He asked me to phrase it that way. Did he explain what he meant by future obligations? I asked. She looked at Calvin then, just for a heartbeat. He said, she stopped, corrected herself. He implied that he wanted a clean break, no lingering expectations, no attachments. My chest constricted. Was he aware I was pregnant at that time? I asked. Matthew was on his feet again. Objection, foundation. Overruled, Judge Navarro said. She can answer. Patricia's voice dropped. Yes, she said. He knew. How do you know he knew? I pressed. Because he told me, she said. He asked me to rearrange his schedule after you told him. He was upset, distracted. He vented. Vented how? I asked. He said the timing was terrible, she replied, each word careful. That the IPO was too close. That a scandal could affect valuations. He said he needed to minimize risk. Risk, not children. Did he ever say he wanted to find out what I chose to do? I asked. To confirm whether I carried the pregnancy to term? She shook her head. No, she said. He said. He hoped you'd take care of it. And if you didn't, that you'd make the responsible decision and not involve him. The room pulsed, soundless. I felt the words like a physical blow. Not because they were new, because they matched exactly what I'd heard in his office. Only now they were no longer mine alone to carry. Miss Lane, I said, my voice thinner than I wanted. Did he ever instruct you to reach out to me after I left? To check on my welfare? To inquire about the baby? No, she whispered. Did you ever see any attempt by him, email, call, message, to contact me in the months or years after? I asked. No, she repeated. I moved to the next document. A printed email. Highlighted. Your Honor, permission to publish a portion of Plaintiff's Exhibit 19 to the witness? I asked. Granted, the judge said. I handed Patricia the page. Is this an email you received from Mr. Hopkins' account? I asked. She read silently, color draining from her face. Yes, she said. Could you read the highlighted paragraph, please? I asked. Her hand trembled. Make sure Roger's exit package is generous enough that she feels treated fairly, but handle it quietly, she read. I don't want any loose threads that could create complications later. No follow-up. No ongoing ties. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Navarro rapped her gavel once. Order, she snapped. Continue, miss. Rogers. I held onto the table edge for a second, grounding myself. Miss Lane, when he said complications, did you understand that to include the pregnancy? I asked. Yes, she said. Did you understand no ongoing ties to include any acknowledgement of potential fatherhood? I asked. Yes. Did he ever express regret, at that time, about how he was handling it? I asked. She hesitated longer this time. No, she said finally. He seemed relieved, like a problem had been efficiently managed. Efficiently managed. That's what we'd been. Me, the babies inside me, a problem. I swallowed the taste of bile. Nothing further at this time, I said, watching him hear himself. Matthew's cross-examination was predictable. Miss Lane, isn't it true that you no longer work for Mr. Hopkins because of a disagreement with his management style? He asked. She blinked. I left because I was tired, she said. 8 years at that level takes a toll. But you weren't promoted the way you'd hoped, correct? He pressed. I wasn't promised a promotion, she replied. He circled, trying to paint her as bitter, biased. But every time he asked, did he say, and she answered, yes. We all heard who had actually written this story. Calvin sat very still. At first, he watched Patricia with the same analytical interest he used to reserve for quarterly reports. By the third email, he stopped looking at her. He stared down at the table instead, jaw flexing, eyes unfocused. For the first time, I realized something that startled me. He had never replayed those conversations. Not really. He'd filed them away as necessary decisions, clean and justified. Now, stripped of context and charm, they were naked in the harsh fluorescent lights. No IPO, no boardroom. No talk of valuations and optics. Just a man who had said, make sure she goes away in a way that won't come back to bite me. And a court hearing the difference between ignorance and intent. The room tilts. When Patricia stepped down, the energy in the courtroom shifted. It was subtle, a straightened spine here, averted eyes there. But something fundamental had cracked in the narrative. This was no longer the story of a good man blindsided by the sudden revelation of fatherhood. This was abandonment with receipts. Judge Navarro called for a short recess. Lawyers stood, whispered, shuffled papers. I sank into my chair, forcing myself to breathe slowly. On the other side, Matthew leaned in close to Calvin. "This doesn't look good," he said, failing to keep his voice entirely low. Calvin's reply was almost inaudible. "I was under pressure," he said. "You know what that time was like for me." Matthew's expression didn't soften. "The court doesn't care how stressed you were," he said. "They care what you did." Calvin glanced over at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from tears, but from the strain of having his self-image peeled away layer by layer. For so long, he had been able to tell himself a cleaner story. She left, she cut me out, I didn't know. Now he'd heard, in his own words, how much he'd known and how deliberately he'd looked away. For a moment, just a sliver of time, I almost pitied him. Not because he didn't deserve this reckoning, because this was the first time he was being forced to see what I had seen the night I walked out. Who he really was when it cost him something. Seeing what he lost. The twins hadn't been in the courtroom for most of the proceedings. They were too young, too impressionable. Their world did not need the echo of gavels and legal jargon imprinted on it yet. But on this day, Teresa had brought them to meet Robert afterward. He wanted to observe them in the courthouse environment, see how they handled transitions, new spaces. So as the recess stretched on, I saw them through the glass window in the door, sitting on a bench just outside, swinging their legs, feet not quite touching the floor. John spotted me first. His whole face lit up. He pointed, said something excitedly to Jessica, then wriggled like he might bolt in my direction if Teresa relaxed her grip for even a second. I felt my heart swell and ache at the same time. Then I noticed Calvin watching them. He hadn't seen them there at first. His attention had been inward, trapped in the echo chamber of his own history. But something, maybe the sound of John's laughter muffled through the door, pulled his gaze. He turned, saw them, really saw them. Not as theoretical minors, not as future heirs, not as problems or solutions. As two small human beings outside a courtroom, waiting for their mother. His face changed in a way I had never seen. Calvin knew numbers, strategies, leverage. He did not know what to do with the sight of his own son's cowlick sticking up in the back the way his had at that age, or with the way Jessica's eyes, his eyes, if he had been honest enough to admit, it tracked every movement, thoughtful and wary. He stood up halfway, as if his body wanted to go to them before his mind could process the urge. "Sit," Matthew hissed under his breath. "We're still in session until the judge returns." But for once, Calvin didn't seem to be listening to his lawyer. He had the look of a man watching a home movie of a life he'd missed. Robert walked over to them, crouched to their level, said something that made Jessica smile shyly. John tugged on his sleeve, pointing through the window, mouthing, "Mama." Calvin swallowed. Hard. His hand went to his mouth like he was physically holding something back. Regret, maybe. Or the sudden, vertigo-inducing realization that there are some opportunities you don't get back. There's a kind of collapse that doesn't look like falling. It looks like a man staying very, very still, because movement would shatter him. The judge returns. All rise. We stood again as Judge Navarro re-entered. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the changed atmosphere. She had been doing this long enough to feel when a case had turned a corner. "Be seated," she said. Everyone settled. "Before we continue with the presentation of evidence," she said, "I want to make a few observations for the record." Her tone was more measured than usual. That alone made my stomach tighten. "This court has heard compelling arguments about material advantage, stability, and emotional bonds," she said. "We've also seen documentation that raises serious concerns about the respondent's past intent." She glanced at the stack of exhibits. "At this stage, it is clear to the court that Mr. Hopkins was aware of a pregnancy and chose not to inquire further, not to confirm, not to provide support," she said. The emails and testimony suggest a deliberate attempt to avoid future responsibility. That is not ignorance, that is abandonment. Calvin's shoulders hunched, just barely. However, she continued, family law is not about freezing people in their worst moments and pretending they cannot change. It is about balancing past conduct with present capacity, always with an eye toward the children's best interests. Present capacity. The phrase felt like a door that could open either way. I am not prepared to rule today, she said. It was like the air got sucked out of the room. I felt my fingers tighten around my pen. Beside me, Chen exhaled quietly, controlled. We still have additional witnesses to hear from, she went on. We still need a full report from Mr. Harris. There are questions that remain about the children's adjustment, about the potential harm of sudden integration, about whether gradual contact, even supervised, could be beneficial or destabilizing. Her gaze moved from me to Calvin and back again. I understand that both of you are desperate for certainty, she said. You will not get it today. My heart sank and steadied in the same beat. I had wanted a clean win, a definitive ruling that said, you were right. He was wrong. It's over. Life rarely gives women like me that kind of ending on schedule. For now, she said, temporary orders remain in effect. Primary physical and legal custody with Miss Rogers. No unsupervised contact for Mr. Hopkins. All visitation, if any, will be arranged through a neutral center with input from Mr. Harris. Matthew started to rise. Your Honor, that places an undue. Sit down, Mr. Lawrence, she said without even looking at him. He did. Reluctantly, she closed the file with a decisive thud. This court will recess until further notice, she said. You will receive a schedule for continued proceedings within 10 days. The gavel fell. Once, twice, then silence, hanging in the balance. People began to move. Lawyers gathered papers. Chairs scraped. The clerk called the next case. But in that cocoon of movement, a strange stillness settled between me and Calvin. We both remained seated for a moment, as if standing meant accepting that whatever came next was out of our hands. Chen touched my arm lightly. You did what you needed to do today, he murmured. I nodded. My throat was too tight to trust my voice. Across the aisle, Matthew was already speaking rapidly into Calvin's ear. Phrases like public perception, damage control, and long game, floating over in pieces. Calvin barely reacted. His eyes flicked once more toward the door, where the twins had disappeared with Robert and Teresa. For the first time, it wasn't clear if he was thinking about shareholders, reporters, or anyone else who usually occupied his mental real estate. He looked human, fallible, late, very, very late. As I gathered my files, a strange calm settled over me. Whatever the judge ultimately decided, the story had changed. The truth was no longer something I whispered to myself at 3 a.m. to stay sane. It was in the record. Under oath. Stamped, filed, preserved. He had not been ignorant. He had been deliberate. He had not been denied. He had walked away. And now, every step he took toward them would be taken in the shadow of that knowledge. Not just mine. His. The judge recessed without ruling. The gavel's echo followed me out into the hallway. It sounded less like an ending than a drumroll. Because the legal fight wasn't over. But something more important had already happened. For the first time since I left his office all those years ago, the weight of what he did wasn't something I carried alone. It was his to hold now, too. Whether he was strong enough to stand under it, that was a question no court could answer for him. Winning didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like the sun on my face outside a courthouse and two small hands tugging at my sleeves, asking for snacks. Outside the courthouse, the concrete steps were still warm from the afternoon heat. John sat on the second one, knees splayed, turning a pebble over and over in his fingers like it was treasure. Jessica leaned against my side, head on my arm, her hair smelling faintly of strawberries and school paint. Teresa stood in front of us, arms folded tight, but face relaxed in a way it hadn't been in weeks. How are you? She asked. People ask that all the time. They usually don't want the real answer. But she did. I started, then stopped, listening to my own body. My shoulders weren't hunched up around my ears. My jaw wasn't clenched. My hands were resting, palms open on my knees. Not bracing anymore, I said. She exhaled a quiet laugh. That's a start, she said. The courthouse doors opened behind us. Lawyers walked past, already on to the next case. For them, this was just another file, another number on a docket. For me, it was 5 years of nights and choices and whispered promises to 2 sleeping children that they would never be anyone's collateral damage. Do we have to go back in? John asked, frowning at the doors like they'd personally offended him. No, I said. We're done for today. Forever? He pressed. Kids always cut to the heart of things. Not forever, I said honestly. But for now, yes. He seemed satisfied with for now. Kids are better at living in the present than adults are. Can we get ice cream? Jessica asked, lifting her head to look up at me. Her eyes were so serious, like the answer might decide more than dessert. Yes, I said. I think today deserves ice cream. What winning actually meant. The ruling had been delivered in a voice that was firm and measured, not triumphant. Family court doesn't do triumph. Primary physical and legal custody will remain with Miss Rogers, Judge Navarro had said. Mr. Hopkins is granted limited, graduated visitation, supervised initially, to be expanded only upon demonstrable consistency and the recommendation of the guardian ad litem. No joint custody, no equal footing. The law had caught up with reality. He was not entitled to step into 5 years of parenting he had walked away from and call it even. There was a time when I would have wanted more. A formal reprimand, harsher words, some public declaration that labeled what he'd done as wrong in language more colorful than abandonment. But as I sat there, listening, something inside me loosened. This wasn't about humiliating him. It wasn't about watching him fall. It was about making sure that the way my children lived matched the way I had lived for them all along, with stability at the center and everything else negotiable. Calvin had asked, weeks earlier, what I wanted from him. The answer was written between every line of that order. I wanted boundaries. I wanted consistency. I wanted proof that if he were going to be in their lives, it would be in a way that didn't rip the ground out from under their feet. He didn't lose his children. He lost the right to pretend he'd always wanted them. There's a difference. Reclaiming more than custody. Teresa sat down on the step beside me, her shoulder touching mine. You did it, she said quietly. I did part of it, I replied. The rest is living with what we all know now. She nodded. You know what I mean, she said. You walked back into the one place he thought you'd never touch his territory, and you didn't flinch. I thought of the first time I saw his name on that legal brief, of the girl I'd been then, 5 years earlier, standing in his office with a test in her bag and hope in her throat. She flinched, I said softly. She just kept walking. Power used to terrify me. His power. The court's power. Money's power. It felt like a current I could drown in if I made one wrong move. Now it felt like something I could stand upright in. Not because it diminished. Because I had grown. Law school didn't give me a new personality. It gave me language for what women like me had always known in our bones and been told to swallow. It gave me ways to say, this is wrong, that didn't require me to scream. It gave me the ability to tell my own story on paper that would outlast anyone's memory. I hadn't just come back for custody. I'd come back for myself. For the part of me that once believed leaving quietly was the only way to survive. I'd proved her wrong. What he chose. What I chose. Through the glass doors, I could see the tail end of Calvin and his team walking down the hallway. He looked different than he had that first day. Not less polished. Just less untouchable. You can't go through a process like this and come out the same. He would have visits now, if he followed the court's conditions. Supervised at first. Awkward, carefully structured hours in rooms with toys that smelled like disinfectant and hope. Maybe, over time, those visits would become something else. Something the twins reached for instead of tolerated. That part wasn't up to me. I'd created the conditions. He'd have to decide who he wanted to be within them. For years, he'd chosen himself. Today, in a way the law could finally see, I'd chosen the twins. That was the only win that mattered. Teresa nudged me lightly. You okay seeing him like this? She asked. I watched him pause to sign a paper with Matthew. His head bent, then straighten and hand the pen back. He's just a man, I said, not a storm. What I came back for. Look, Mama, John said suddenly, tugging my sleeve. He held up his pebble. It glinted slightly in the late afternoon light. It's shiny, he said proudly. It is, I agreed. Jessica slid her hand into mine again, fingers small but sure. Are we going home now? She asked. Yes, I said. We're going home. Home, where their drawings covered the fridge. Where their shoes piled up by the door. Where there was always at least one cup in the sink, and one sock missing, and laughter echoing down the hallway at inappropriate times. Home, where my degrees hung not as trophies, but as reminders that I had built a life from the ground up in spite of the man who'd thought we were too risky to claim. Winning, I realized, wasn't the order with my name on it. It was this, knowing that whatever contact came next with their father, it would happen on terms that didn't rewrite history. Knowing that they would grow up with a mother who did not run from hard things, who stood up when standing, felt like the last thing she could do. Knowing that when they were old enough to ask questions, I could look them in the eyes and answer without shame. I didn't come back to take anything from him, I said softly, more to myself than anyone else. Teresa glanced at me. What did you come back for? She asked, even though she already knew. I looked at the twins, at their messy hair, their scuffed shoes, the way they trusted my hands to hold theirs without thinking about it. For them, I said, to protect what he never chose. Walking away. This time different. We stood. I took John's hand in my left, Jessica's in my right. Their fingers curled around mine instinctively. Teresa fell into step beside us as we walked down the courthouse steps. I'd climbed them alone the first time. Pregnant, scared, bracing. Now I walked down with the weight I'd chosen in each hand and no weight on my shoulders that didn't belong to me. Behind us, the building loomed, full of other people's stories. Ahead of us, the sidewalk stretched toward a future that still held questions, complications, compromises. Life doesn't stop being hard because a judge signs your name on the right line. But it does get clearer. I didn't hurry. I didn't look back to see if Calvin was watching from behind the glass. He'd had his chance to follow me once before. He hadn't taken it. This time, I wasn't running. I was simply leaving. On my terms. Mama, Jessica said, swinging our arms gently. Can we get sprinkles? Yes, I said, smiling. We'll get sprinkles. We walked away from the courthouse steady, unafraid, finished with the kind of running that hides. Whatever came next, I knew this much. I hadn't come back for revenge. I'd come back to stand between my children and the story he'd once chosen for them. And I'd done it. Marion's story isn't just about one woman and one custody case. It's about every woman who was ever told she was asking for too much when she was really just asking to be seen. It's about every mother who did the impossible, raised children alone, went to school, exhausted, became her own lawyer, her own protector, her own voice. It's about the moment you stop waiting for someone to give you permission to protect what's yours. And it's about understanding that winning doesn't always look like a clean ending. Sometimes it looks like walking away from a courthouse with your children's hands in yours, knowing you stood up when it mattered most. If Marion's story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or someone you love who fought their own quiet battle, share this video. Share it with your daughters, your sisters, your friends who need to know that leaving doesn't make you weak, and coming back doesn't make you vengeful. It just makes you a woman who refused to let someone else write the ending. Comment below and tell me, what's one battle you fought that no one saw? What's one time you became your own hero? Because your story matters just as much as Marion's. And subscribe to this channel because we tell the stories that remind women they were never the problem. They were always the solution. Stories of mothers who became warriors. Stories of women who outgrew the people who underestimated them. Stories that end not with revenge, but with something better. Peace. Hit that subscribe button. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need validation to know your worth. And you don't need anyone's approval to protect what you love. Marion proved that. And so can you. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.